Hello, and welcome to another episode of The Bike Shed, a weekly podcast from your friends at thoughtbot about developing great software. I'm Sally Hall.
And I'm Aji Slater. And together we're here to share a bit of what we've learned along the way.
So, Aji, what's new in your world?
What is new in my world? I think the most interesting thing, to me at least, is my continual mission to try and get something like processing to work with Ruby. Are you familiar with processing? I guess it's a library.
No. I
Uh,
was like, the concept? Yes. I do know that word.
it is interestingly named, but it is a JavaScript, sorry, not JavaScript. There is a JavaScript version of it, but it is a Java library for doing computer art, and so basically rendering imagery to a screen, and it has a lot of different tools. And it's basically, as far as I know, it's one of the most powerful, kind of easy to pick up versions of this sort of thing. But it's in Java, and there is a JavaScript version, which is P5.js. And those are just not the language that I prefer to work in.
Yeah.
Of course, I prefer working in Ruby, but there isn't a Ruby version of something like this. Not really, or at least not something that's very well maintained. So I've tried a couple of different ways to use the processing or the P5 runtime essentially with Ruby. And none of those attempts have been as successful as I would hope. I tried a little bit today to use WASM.
Could you spell that for me? What is that?
Yeah, WASM is
Oh, okay.
WebAssembly. As soon as I said it, I was like, do I need to say WebAssembly? Because WASM just sounds weird to
Yeah.
say. Uh, but yeah, trying to interop with JavaScript through Ruby using WebAssembly, and ran into some hurdles that I didn't really expect, like just defining a function through js.eval was not as straightforward as I had expected. So that kind of, I'm not going to say yet that it fell through, but it certainly ran into a few more roadblocks than I was expecting. And I was expecting a few. So the best library for doing this sort of thing that I've found is Dragon Ruby, which
Mhm.
is a game making toolkit. And the issue there is if I want to like share what I'm working on, things like that, Dragon Ruby is not free. There's a license fee, which I was happy to pay because I think people should get paid for the software, and this is the kind of support model that they've adopted. But I know that not everyone has, I think, something like $75, $80 US just free to spend on something like that. So I've been looking for a more open and available alternative, but I think right at the moment the runtime that is best for this sort of thing that I found is Dragon Ruby, and I've
Okay.
been really enjoying it. But it's hard to share.
Yeah. That's that's really interesting. What kind of things do you what kind of art do you make with this? Is this
Yeah,
how you do the illustrations I've seen of yours?
no, actually, that's just with Procreate and my iPad. But this is I'm a big fan of the YouTube channel Coding Train,
Mhm.
and he has um, videos on there of coding challenges that are just kind of generative art, and not in the AI way, but through a computer, and little coding challenges that are just like little puzzles, and they're kind of like almost like katas, but they're a little more because it's implementing some kind of algorithm or function, usually even something that he's just read a paper about and he's implementing from scratch. And those little projects seem super fun, and they're all done through processing or P5. And so the things that can output what I would like to do and experiment with, I'll take that kind of runtime. So
Nice. That sounds exciting.
what about yourself?
So this past week or so, I'm working on a project now that is a lot more React than Ruby and Rails, which is I'm learning a lot about it. I've talked about that, but it's still not my preferred stack to live in.
Hmm.
And I had just wrapped up a fairly big ticket that was very React heavy, and was like, I need a React break. I cannot jump right into another one of these right now. And discovered what felt sort of like a secret hack to not having to do React every day all the time, which is started picking up some like sort of maintenance developer experience things. So
Uh,
I wrote a little GitHub action step for our CI workflow to check if the schema is updated, because it's a big project, a lot of teams,
mm,
and we've got this gem that annotates models with output from the schema when you migrate. So
hmm.
it's not just schema.rb that gets updated when you run a migration. It's like all of the affected model files. And it's been just kind of tedious keeping all of that up to date and making sure a migration doesn't get checked in without all of the associated updated files. So just did a really quick and dirty little bit that basically runs git it runs the migrations and then does git diff, and if there's any output from git diff, fails the CI thing and says you have not updated your schema, or I think there's a better error message than that there. So but I'm hoping that that'll be enough of a little reminder for all of us that we um, keep it up to date, because it's been, just one of those silly, like, or not silly, but like one of those small things that's easy to overlook, but then everybody else on the team ends up having to uh, sort of sidestep the files that should have been updated, or add unrelated file updates to their PR. It's been kind of,
Right.
just like one of those small annoying things that,
Yeah, and this will take away some of that mental overhead, right?
yeah, yeah.
Nice.
We've especially got a lot of people who are new to Rails, like a lot of really
Mm,
great developers who just, spent much of their career in another stack. And so, and that can be confusing if you're not like super familiar with all the ways that a schema migration can get off, like, get out of sync with what it should be. So there's also been like just a lot of conversations on Slack that like, it's not just mental load. It's also people going, hey, I don't understand why this changed when I ran DB migrate. This is
right.
totally unrelated, but now it's telling me I have a diff that doesn't make sense to me.
That's really interesting having to kind of navigate a large difference in experience. People might be familiar with that, doing that on their own team, having earlier career developers join a project. But what's that like when it's the client developers who are not as experienced in the stack that is kind of our bread and butter?
Yeah, it's actually been really interesting, because, like I said, they're all, like, from my experience, really great developers.
Mm,
They just, spent most of their career in like .NET or Java, or I don't even know, all kinds of stuff. So it's been a different balance of sort of how to approach things and like offer feedback, I think, in like code reviews and pairing sessions.
mm,
In some ways it's really similar, right? Like, um I like to think that when I'm working with someone who is really early career, I want to treat them with as much respect and assuming good intent, and not assuming that they're going to ruin something or don't know something as I can.
of course.
But working with, more senior developers with different experience, the explanations are less like this is what this does, and more like how do we find the analogous thing for the stack that you're used to,
Mm,
right? This isn't a totally new concept for you, it's just a thing that you usually do a different way.
right, right. Do you find that those kind of analogies or explanations come very easily? Because I would think most of my repertoire for that sort of thing is going to be aimed at people who are newer to programming, and I don't have the toolbox to talk to somebody who's experienced but new to Rails.
Yeah, it's I feel like weirdly JavaScript becomes the like common ground,
Hmm.
because anybody making a full stack app, no matter what different technologies you're using for the back end, if it's interactive, it's going to have some JavaScript in it most likely. And the app that they've been working on in the past at this same company is heavily React. So they're all familiar with React and JavaScript. So I find, if we can both sort of translate a little bit into what we mean in JavaScript world, then, that can sometimes bridge the gap between whatever else we're trying to do.
Interesting. So JavaScript is kind of that shared language touch point. This
Yeah,
makes me think of
JavaScript to this project is like French to the Olympics. Or,
right. Yeah, I was surprised the first time I got a U.S. passport to see so much French on it, but that's the international language of diplomacy, apparently. So even though we don't have multiple or any national language here in the States, to see French singled out when it seems like such a low percentage spoken language here, just kind of comparatively to the whole, was interesting.
yeah,
JavaScript spoken more.
yeah. I'm better at JavaScript than I am at French, but I think I like French better. There's not a lot of conversations around cheese in JavaScript.
No, that's not part of the standard library, at least.
No.
So when you're when you're navigating that gap, you mentioned code review and pairing. Are those what you might normally reach for? Are those kind of the first line of defense? Isn't the right word, but you know what I mean.
Yeah, I think those are the places where like the opportunity for mentoring is most straightforward.
Mm-hmm.
Like or for feedback and learning. Sort of the whole point of a code review is to get feedback on the code. So it's like
Sure.
really a natural place to talk about it. And then pairing, pretty similar.
Right.
You're pairing often because one or the other or both of you have a question and want two brains instead of one. Um, I think that's not always why people pair. Sometimes we pair because we just like to pair
Mm-hmm.
because we know that we're going to get better code. Um, but I think there's it's I think something that's been a little difficult to figure out how to squeeze in is sort of bigger picture things,
Mm.
right? Like I can put a comment on your PR about why I prefer not using before blocks in a RSpec test,
Mm-hmm.
right? But is that the right place to have like a conversation about like higher level approach to testing philosophies,
Mm.
right? Because it's not whether, my preference doesn't mean what they're doing is incorrect, right? Like that works. You can write tests that way, and lots of people do, and people prefer that. But that's not how I prefer it, and it's not sort of what we suggest in our thoughtbot guides.
Mm-hmm.
So it's been an interesting challenge to sort of like judge when is this a one off bit of feedback? When is this a larger conversation with this person? And when is this a larger conversation with the whole team?
Right. Right. Yeah, I find often that code review can be one of the most hmm, specific sort of
Mhm.
places when there is one thing that you want to talk about specifically because you've got this example of it right in front of you. Like
Right.
this use case is, you don't have to think about some alternative use case or some story that might come up later or something like that. You can actually talk about what's in front of you together, but it does have that trade-off of not really sharing to the wider group, not getting more opinions or just kind of more eyes on it because it is tailored to the person that's opened the pull request, and not everyone on the team is going to be reviewing that before it goes along. So
Yeah. And I think it also depends sort of, like the urgency of the code change and um, is it Friday afternoon? Like if this is code, like if this is a bug fix and we need to get it out there and it's the end of the day and I am tired and you give me a suggestion with some like higher level context, I might just take your suggestion and trust that you know what you're doing. And, if it works, move on without really thinking about why you made that suggestion or maybe without reading into, your explanation because I don't have it in me to learn in this moment. I have it in me to fix this thing and move on. Um, So I think there's some, balance there of like, an urgent bug fix is probably not the right PR on which to have a in-depth discussion about testing philosophy.
Yeah, agreed.
Which is actually a choice I had to make like 2 days ago. Um, and sometimes the right thing to do is like, yep, this works. This is fine. I will make a note to myself to either have this conversation later or make a ticket to refactor this or bring this up in a team wide discussion later.
Yeah, I think that gets to the root of something that a lot of people struggle with in these sort of situations, and I certainly have, where letting, quote unquote, letting some things go, or like this isn't the right opportunity for talking about this, or like we need to pull back a little bit and have this as a wider team conversation. Those sort of things where you might decide to not comment,
Mm-hmm.
or sort of not make the suggestions, or even if you're pairing, not kind of go into this rabbit hole of what that's going to be. And I think a lot of people get hung up on inconsistency, maybe that they're letting
Yeah.
something into the code base and then that's going to live there forever and we're going to have to maintain it, or we're going to have to remember to come back to it and refactor it. So what are your kind of thoughts and feelings around that problem that arises when you're having to judge these different moments?
Yeah. I think that's a really good point because it does, in those moments where it's just not the time to have that conversation and what's being proposed as a merge is good enough. um, it can, feel a little bit icky to be like, but everywhere else we do this other thing,
Hmm.
or most other places we do this other thing, or ideally we would do this other thing. Um, but I think, right, like, have you ever written an app without any tech debt? No, like
No.
literally no one in the world has,
No.
right? So I think it's, the everybody's favorite answer, 42. I mean, it depends. It depends, right? So there's not every line of code in a code base can be the best version of itself, right? Like you can't, sort of the idea of like you can't be 100% every day all the time, and neither can your code.
Aw.
Some bits of it are going to be a little better than others, and some bits of it are going to be opportunities to come back later and update it, and then there's sometimes where like it's worth doing like an audit of a code base to be like, we are inconsistent in the way that we're doing this thing, and that feels like enough of a problem that we should make a concerted effort to decide which way we want to do this thing
Hmm.
and do it across the app. And then, if we're lucky and there's a way to do it, add some sort of automated check or linter
Aha, there you go.
so that going forward, it's the only way you can do it.
Right.
Yeah. What do you think?
Uh, yeah, I definitely agree. I'm gonna do the thing again. There was a keynote.
Wait, keynotes?
Yeah,
Ajay?
there's a keynote at RailsConf, a talk that Sarah May gave about livable code, and sort of taps into this idea that, again, it's really about teamwork and collaboration and people. That's the first thing in the job, even if the output a lot of the times is code, and making those decisions about, is this the right moment? Do we as a team have capacity for this? Does this person I'm talking to have capacity for this? There's a lot of other questions that are going to give you more value back than necessarily focusing on 100% consistency within the code base. That having shared buy-in, having a team aligned and kind of all operating in the same direction is, at the end of the day, going to be a lot more important for the longevity of the code base than is having 100 little nitpicks on every PR because you want everything to look exactly the same. Like, that's a great goal, but it shouldn't be done like at the PR level, but at that kind of consensus building level.
Yeah. I think there's also a piece of it that I like to think in mind when I'm working with other people, which is like the confidence of the person who wrote the code.
Hmm.
Um, and I find, if I go to review a PR and I can see that there's already been a lot of back and forth and a lot of nitpicking,
Hmm.
and I see some things that I think, ideally should be changed, but are not blockers. Sometimes I just won't say anything because I'm
Yeah.
like, I've been there. I don't want to put this person through yet another round of like, okay, what did I screw up this time? Or like,
Right. Right.
what did I do wrong? Um, which isn't to say like let people merge bad code or their feelings will get hurt. um, but like sometimes it is a little bit more important to have somebody be able to wrap up a task and count it as complete and good than to have all of your formatters working exactly the same way and use the same way across the app or whatever.
Yeah. Yeah. 100%.
I think
You're.
that's actually one thing that's different. That's one
Hmm.
distinct difference between working with early career developers and senior developers who are switching to stacks
Hmm.
is that right, it's not like, oh, they've been coding for 20 years so you can just be a jerk to them. But once you get to know a team member, you can kind of know sort of like you're a person who responds well to lots of little nitpicks and you appreciate those, and you've got enough context in your career to be able to separate yourself from your code.
Right.
And so it can be a little easier to like
Go a little deeper on some of
go,
that feedback.
yeah, or like a little more nitpicky.
Hmm. Yeah, for sure. I think that's part of being of leveling up and kind of being in this job for longer, is that you know that sometimes things, or often things, take longer than you think from the outset,
Uh-huh.
and so you're going to be a little more ready for rounds of feedback, things like that, as opposed to somebody who's new, who it's very easily to be demoralized by feedback, even if it's delivered in the most gracious and generous way. That just the fact of this isn't done yet can really put a strain on you.
Yeah, it can feel like you're running a marathon and they keep moving the marker at the end of it.
Oof.
I don't run marathons. Oosh.
That's a lot of miles to then like drag it off a mile as you're approaching the finish line. Yeah,
Yeah,
that's an awful feeling, and you don't want to do that to someone else.
yeah.
I
I think
think.
you're right though that that's something we learn as we go along. Like at this point in my career, when I create a pull request, I don't really think of that as, and now I'm done. I think of it as, and now we do this part.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I hadn't sort of separated those in my mind, but I definitely can think back to my first few years, and PR was like, okay, it's finished, and it's like, no, no, this is the next step in the process.
Yeah. And sometimes the longest step and the most important step, depending on how it goes.
True, true. That's something I love the draft PR feature for. You
Yes.
can be not completely done with something, but you want feedback early on in the process. And that has been super helpful for me any number of times, to be able to just put something up and get some other eyes on it if we're not a team that is pairing very much, or we don't have time at the moment, or we've got something like really parallelized. And so we're sort of sticking in our own streams for a bit. But
Mm-hmm.
yeah, having that earlier feedback can be invaluable.
Yeah. I've also definitely been guilty of using the draft PR as a way to open a PR that I know is bad, or not
Mm.
bad, but I'm like, there's no way this is the best way to do this.
Mm-hmm.
It does what it's supposed to do, and I could call it done, but I don't really want the rest of my team to think this is code that we should merge.
Yeah, what is that law? The fastest way to find out the answer to something isn't searching for the right answer, but it's saying the wrong thing on the internet.
Oh, yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yep. I think that can also be, I've seen that used as a way to get people who are like maybe reluctant to collaborate in what feels like a traditional collaboration environment to give feedback,
Hmm.
right? So if I say, like, hey, can you help me decide the best way to implement this component? They might be like, mm. No, I don't want to do that. But
Right.
if I say, hey, I implemented this component, look at it, then, that framing might make it easier for them to give feedback on that.
Would you consider that sometimes as an opening or a way to mentor or kind of pass on knowledge? Is that another tool in your toolkit to kind of put something out there to start the discussion like that?
Oh, that's interesting. I think I hadn't thought of it that way, but it absolutely can be for sure. Instead of asking a question or giving direct feedback, saying, hey, you give me feedback.
Yeah, I love that there are so many different approaches and sort of things that you can modulate when you're doing this sort of like invisible mentorship work, because what it really boils down to, I think, is understanding the individual that you're working with is the
Yeah.
most important way. Like, how do they respond best to feedback? What do they want something that is to the point and gets right to it? Do they want something with supporting evidence? Do they want examples? Were they better at pairing and understanding a concept? Like, not only just to understand the concept, but also how do they receive feedback and kind of information from another person?
Yeah. Yeah. And like, sometimes there'll be a bit of feedback where I'm like, I know this person will react better to this if I don't put it on the PR
Mm-hmm.
and maybe just approach them one on one. Make sure that like for certain personalities or people that you've worked with and you get to know, like it might feel like an attack in public
Right.
when it's not meant to be an attack at all.
Yeah.
And so finding a way to do that, one on one or, yeah, just like in a different context.
Hmm.
Um, I think it's also important to know which of your teammates will appreciate a joke in their feedback and which of them
Hmm.
will not.
True. True.
Yeah.
Yeah, I feel like the more emoji I am using in a comment or some kind of feedback, is a pretty good indicator of how uncertain I am with the way that you interpret text. So if I don't know how, say, new to the team, either on my side or their side, um, I don't know what their preference and their kind of communication style is and things like that. I will probably overuse emoji, just because I really like emoji, but also I think it does that little bit of work to get tone across in a way that text can't.
Yeah. Yeah. If I'm trying to rip you and your work apart, I'm probably not going to put silly little pictures in. So when I put the silly little pictures in, I'm not trying to rip you apart.
Right. Right. Yeah, and that's never where we're coming from, is to rip somebody apart. But I swear I had something better to say about that.
Yeah. Um, I think another sort of version of invisible mentoring can be, leaning on my own humility a little bit.
Hmm.
Sometimes, um, my knee jerk reaction to some code will be like, what on earth is this? And then I think about it and I'm like, well, this person is not, you know, intentionally writing bad code or
Right.
a terrible at their job. So it's often a good, I find, I'll start writing like, I don't think you should have done this. I think maybe we should do this instead, and then just delete it and instead say like, hey, I'm not familiar with this approach. Can you walk me through it?
Yeah.
And a lot of the times it'll be a good approach and I learn something new, or we walk through it together and sort of find our way to a better solution.
Yeah. Yeah. Because there's always 100 different ways to accomplish something. Even if you're using exactly the same strategy, there's still probably multiple ways, if not dozens of ways to do a thing. And there have been plenty of times where something looked like it was completely out of left field, and then I got an explanation behind why. Um, I will litter PR comments with for my learning, or like for my
Oh yeah.
understanding, right? Because half of the time, more than half, closer probably to 100% of the time, it's just something that I hadn't seen before, and there's a cool reason behind it, and because I asked that question, now it's part of what I can do as well.
And there's very likely somebody else reading that PR who had the same question.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That's leaning on that humility again. It's like
Yeah.
multiple people have this question. I'm going to ask it because
Yeah.
that's just part of the role on the team that I'm taking on. Yeah.
And the way different people communicate, you and I have talked a lot about what it is like to be neurodivergent at work. And I found that different people with different neurotypes respond differently to a question, why did you do this?
Hmm.
Right? Even if my intention is literally, I just want to know why because I think it's interesting, it can be easily interpreted as this is a bad thing and you should feel bad about having done it.
Right.
Which is, I only mean that when I go to my pantry and the horrible teenagers that live in my house that I made have left a cookie box with half a cookie in it. That when I say, why did you do this? That means you're a horrible person who should feel bad about the time. But, at work, that's not what I mean.
Right. Right.
So I think, prefacing with for my own learning is a good way to do that.
Yeah.
I had an experience very early on in my development career where I opened a PR. I, have no idea what it was for or the context of anything. And my manager commented on part of the PR with just the phrase, why did you do this?
Mm.
And then I think went on vacation.
Oh
I
no.
may be misremembering this. This is, this might be like a fairy tale that has evolved in my head. But and I remember just feeling awful, like that I had done a terrible thing and had no way to ask for clarification. And, with some experience and kindness in my heart, I can look back and realize they might have just been trying to get me to reflect on my decisions.
Mm-hmm.
It's entirely possible that I had done the right thing and they just wanted to make sure that I knew why, because I was learning stuff. I was really early career.
Mm-hmm.
But it felt really bad.
Yeah.
And so I definitely never want to do that to anybody else.
Yeah. I think that's a good example of this idea. I think that we've been kind of circling around and speaking of to assume the best intent, realize that
Yeah.
everyone is doing the best they can with what they have at the time, and kind of always resetting to that whenever you're doing this kind of feedback. That is applicable on both sides too, right? The uh, the person who's leaving feedback that you may have interpreted a certain way. I know I have a huge bias personally towards feedback seeming negative, even though I know for a fact it isn't. But
Mm-hmm.
making those same assumptions and kind of coming from the same place with the people who's leaving feedback, not just when you yourself are leaving feedback.
Right. Yeah. Reading the question, why did you do this? And trying to frame that in your mind as this is not an accusation. This is a
Right.
genuine, sincere question.
Yeah, absolutely.
And if it's not a genuine, sincere question and you answer it as though it is, maybe it will make the person who asked it reflect on the way they addressed you.
Interesting. Interesting. Yeah.
Another frame that I like to use is assume. Don't. It's really hard to balance assuming what a person may or may not know, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, and getting it wrong in either direction can feel pretty bad to the person who's you've made the assumption about.
Right.
Like if I assume you have no idea what a hash is and you've been doing Ruby for 30 years, I don't even know, 20 years, and I start talking to you like you've just discovered computers, that is probably going to feel frustrating and you're going to feel like I think you're stupid.
Right.
But on the other hand, if you have never used Ruby before, and I just start assuming that you know all of these words that I'm going to use,
Mm-hmm.
that can discourage you from asking me any questions and also just make you feel stupid and like I haven't, like you are not as good at this as I expect you to be, and that you are somehow failing by not knowing the
Yeah.
words that I'm using.
Yeah.
So I find that balance can be kind of pretty tricky. Do you have any approaches for that?
I think I try to, I don't always remember, but I try to, anytime there's a concept or something that's outside of the current context, um, usually will go with a link, because if someone understands the term, then they're not going to bother clicking through that link and they can just move forward. But if they haven't heard that term or concept before, then they can click through the link and kind of get the background or something like that. I find that's a kind of low effort way
Mhm.
to include some context along. The Thoughtbot blog is great for that because I can usually just go and pick an article over the 20 years of amazing articles that can reinforce or introduce the thing that I'm talking about. Yeah, so I think at first I thought I didn't really have an approach, but I think that is my approach. Or if there's an acronym, to just spell it out the first time in whatever correspondence that I'm doing, if it's not something that's like a shared team acronym. um, it can feel sometimes like, well, I'm writing the thing out anyway, why didn't I just write it out? But then you can use the acronym then later on in the same message, because you've sort of introduced it. And so yeah, not assuming that what you think is basic knowledge is going to be basic knowledge for everyone, I think is a big one. That, again, being neurodivergent and just kind of weird and interesting in my own little rabbit holes and like minutia of things, I've come across plenty of times where I'll say something thinking that everyone knows it because I learned it a long time ago or something like that, but it was really this niche topic that is not something that everyone's come across. And so like I've had that experience of people looking at me quizzically after I just said something that seemed completely mundane. It's like, oh, right, I should not be assuming that my experience is the same as everyone's experience.
Yeah. I feel like some of the points you hit on remind me of like, the way I learned to write research papers in college.
Hmm.
Like, have a bibliography, link to these things.
Hmm.
When you introduce a new term, define it. Things
Yeah.
like that. It's like, oh, are we just like writing little research papers every time we review this? We are.
I think a little bit, yeah.
Yeah.
Uh, Also, I got that from philosophy classes that in order to be able to talk about something, you need to have a shared language, or a shared, not glossary, but a shared lexicon,
Yeah.
um, that you understand that when you say something, the other person is going to understand it in the same way. So even if you might know that this person reading it is familiar with this concept, but you're not sure if in the particular angle that you're using it or something, it can still be good to define that term or something like that, just to make sure that you're all starting from the same place.
Yeah. Like when you talked about the processing tool earlier.
Right.
Yeah. I think I've been thinking about, because I feel like a lot of what we've just talked about has been, in written conversations,
Hmm.
right? How do we share information and balance the you might know this or you might not know this? And I think in verbal conversations, I feel like I've handled this and trying to think of how I've done it. And I think part of it is saying, like, you probably already know this, but, and
Hmm.
then starting, which is both giving them the benefit of the doubt and assuming that they're not completely ignorant of whatever you're about to say, but also explaining it anyway, just in case A, they are ignorant of what you're about to say, or B, you understand it in a totally different way, or C, I'm wrong
Right.
about what I'm saying.
Right.
um, yeah, just sort of approaching every conversation assuming that we're peers with good intent.
Yeah, that's a great way to put that. Assuming that we're peers. I like that a lot. I think leading with empathy and humility is never going to be a bad approach to collaboration.
Yeah, yeah. Um, and it can take away some intimidation too. I've actually sometimes have to think about that myself when I'm working with someone who I know has a lot more experience than me, or
Hmm.
who I'm like, a little intimidated or in awe of. And I go to ask them a question. I find it harder to assume that we're peers in that case, but
Hmm.
it feels equally important there, and not just like,
Yeah.
oh, holy oracle, please tell me how to import this thing. Um,
Yeah. Again, it works both ways.
yeah, It's weird how often things boil down to just be nice to each other.
What?
Yeah. Is it really just all about people and kindness after all?
I think it is. I
Possibly
think it
be.
is. We may have cracked it. I think we cracked it. This is it.
All
The
right.
final
That's
episode
the
of the Bike
answer.
Shed.
Kindness.
We got to the
Kindness.
end.
Wrapping up. Sorry, Joel. We just solved it all without you.
I think this is actually a topic that we could go on for years, if not entire careers. So we will probably have to come back to this very rich vein at some point.
Yeah.
But for now, should we wrap it up?
Yeah, I think so.